Welcome to Rooted in God's Love, the masterclass series for Christian women who desire to feel the Father's unconditional love, get grounded in their true identity in Him, and courageously pursue their God-given purpose. I'm your host, ALANA, and I use biblical principles and cognitive behavioral therapy to help women get deeply rooted in their identity in Christ, love who God created them to be, and wake up joyful every day living out their kingdom purpose. And today I am super excited to introduce you to the lovely Katey Maddux. Katey is an entrepreneur, speaker, writer, and warrior. After overcoming the adversity of sexual trauma, Katey's mission is to teach women across the globe how to find purpose in their pain. By walking through the skills and strategy behind tackling deep wounds, she's able to help people build a bridge to freedom, purpose, and their identity in Christ. So beautiful. Welcome, Katey. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about one of my personally favorite topics to discuss, which is purpose in pain. And before we dive into this amazing topic, which I think is going to bless so many women watching, maybe you can tell our audience a little bit more about your own story of overcoming and finding purpose in your own pain.
Yeah. So hello, everyone. My name is Katey Maddux. I'm super excited to be with you. And my story started, well, I'm originally from West Bloomfield, Michigan, and I had moved to Texas to go to college when I was 18 years old. And I've lived all over the world. I currently live in Miami, Florida. But my purpose and pain story really started in Texas in 2013. I was raped by somebody the same day that I broke up with my boyfriend of 5 years. And the relevance of it being on the same day was that I didn't have the emotional capacity to deal with both. And so I subconsciously chose one over the other. And the other one, I said, I'm not going to deal with the rape. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to move past it because I have this other massive thing that I need to deal with, this big breakup. And I thought I was going to marry this man. Like I was already ready to plan our wedding. And so I said, I've also seen what girls that have been raped and came forward, especially in my friend circle, I'd seen my own friends have been raped and come forward. And people who knew the guys, because they were also in our friend circle, I'd say, oh, he would never do that. And so I thought, I don't want to go through that kind of trauma. I don't want to have my friend circle turn on me. I'm just not going to deal with that or talk about it. I'm just going to move on with my life, deal with my breakup and move forward. And I think temporarily I thought that was working for me. Obviously looking back, hindsight is 2020. It wasn't. I got involved with drugs and heavy partying during that time of my life, and I started taking Adderall on a daily basis. I wasn't sleeping well, and after about 6 months of that, or actually about a year of that, I would say, I felt God kind of reel me back in, and He was like, "We need to change something." And I ended up leaving and moving to South Korea and starting a whole new life completely. And in doing so, I thought that I was leaving my past behind. I was leaving all that drama and baggage and issues that I had buried. That was in the past. I was starting a new life. It was going to be fine. And then I moved back to the States, and my past started to kind of bubble up. Not because I saw people that were involved in it. I moved to Miami when I came back to the States. But more so, I think, because when my life started to calm down, that's when God said, okay, now you're ready to deal with this. I'm going to kind of start letting this come back up. And as it started to bubble up, I realized, oh, actually, this is something that needs process. This isn't something that you can just brush under the rug and it'll go away with time. It doesn't go away with time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you moved back, and what happened when you were in South Korea? Like, were you able to cover up the pain enough that you didn't really know that it was there and you just covered it up with other things? But then what's changed for you as well in coming back to the US?
In Korea, I say it didn't affect me because it didn't affect me when I was sober. Really, this stuff was only triggered when I was either involved with alcohol or other forms of heavy partying. I would have panic attacks that I wouldn't remember, but my friends, they remembered them and they would be like, Katey, last night you were completely terrified of this person who is your friend, a guy. If he came within 10 feet of you, you would just freak out and cry. And you were so afraid that he was going to hurt you. And I would have no memory of it.
Wow.
And So as far as I was concerned, it wasn't really affecting me because I didn't remember it. But when I got back to the States, it started affecting me when I was sober. And that was more the issue. I started dating when I came back to the States. And it was in dating, especially with the guys. Dating in Miami has been different than dating in other places in the States. The culture is different. And guys, in my experience, tended to be more forward and more pushy. And I don't think that they're malicious. I don't think they're trying to hurt you. They're just more aggressive. And because I had triggers that had not been dealt with, that pushiness combined with my triggers created panic attacks. It created fear. It had all these negative emotions that started coming out. And as somebody who thought that I didn't have to deal with this and it would just go away, I was thinking, where did all of this come from? I've been fine for 5 years. Why is it just now that I'm triggered by people? And so I felt like God was like, really, you need to deal with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, we've talked about the fact that you have to acknowledge your pain to be able to heal from it. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. As long as we're in denial of the fact that something needs to be processed, I think we don't allow ourselves to create the time and space to process it. And I think it's important too that we label trauma as traumatic, because as long as we don't label it as traumatic, we don't give ourselves permission to cry or to be like, allowing ourselves to maybe take a mental health day and say, hey, there's something that I really need to spend some alone time with God, spend some quiet time with God, take the day off work if I need to. If we're not labeling our experience as traumatic, we're not going to allow ourselves to do those things. And I hadn't ever labeled my rape as traumatic because it wasn't this horrific thing that you see on TV. He wasn't fighting, it wasn't screaming, he didn't hurt me, physically hurt me, like abuse me or anything, um, because I had been raped while I was unconscious. So I woke up in the middle to somebody having sex with me and I knew them. And so I thought, well, you weren't even awake for it. So how traumatic can it really be? Just move on. And so once I got to the point where I could say, no, actually, this is a form of trauma and it's affecting my daily life, then it was okay. I'm acknowledging that this was actually quite painful because I had never done that before.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think there's so many parallels to the women listening right now and watching and hearing your story where they've been through something and they've swept it under the carpet thinking it's okay, I don't need to deal with this. It's not a big deal. And they just try to move forward. They try to push on. But that pain gets buried in our subconscious. It gets
Mhm.
buried deep inside us, and then it affects everything we do, right? Because 95% of what we do, what we say, comes out of our subconscious belief system. So if we've gone through trauma and we've buried it deep down, we don't even realize sometimes that we're drinking out of that place, we're doing drugs out of that place, we're yelling at someone we love out of that place, all of those things that come out of us. So did you ever recognize any of those things when you were drunk and you knew it came up but you didn't remember it? But did you ever get any glimpses of something's not right, like I feel like something deep down needs to be dealt with and I don't know what it is? Did you ever catch glimpses of that before you came back to the US?
What Right after it had happened, I started seeing somebody very casual. We weren't actually like dating, like boyfriend and girlfriend. But with him, he triggered it and he knew it, but he was very aware. He had dated somebody before who had been raped, so he was very aware of how his actions could make me feel. But then I thought, since that was only a month after, and then it kind of went into hibernation, it really wasn't until I moved back to the States that I started recognizing that if somebody was making me feel uncomfortable or I was afraid around a group of men, that the two were correlated. I hadn't put that piece of it together. I used to go to music festivals and I was terrified that my guy friends would leave me alone and they didn't understand why I was so afraid. And I didn't either, honestly, because as you know, I've traveled a lot. I've traveled by myself to 50 countries. I'm not fearful in that way in my natural state. I'm happy to travel, the world by myself. But there was something where once I'd had a drink or two, I had this really crazy fear. And I hadn't associated that with it was actually a fear that somebody was going to take advantage of me. But it really hit home when I got back to the States and I started dating. And yeah, just when guys would, I don't know, just too much pressure, and my reaction wasn't in correlation to the amount of pressure they had put. A normal person would be like, hey, I'm not okay with that. You know what I mean? Whereas I would be like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? Don't do that, freaking out when it wasn't in line, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting that, even though it was buried, it just popped up. Years later, it just popped up and gave you this awareness. And I wonder how many women watching are going through something like that, where they know something happened to them when they were younger, they
Mhm.
buried it, they haven't realized that it's affecting their life yet.
Right.
And that awareness might even be coming up in this moment, or it might come up in the near future. And I think it's so important to take that seriously. And if it does pop up, not to keep sweeping it under the carpet, which is so easy to do when we're busy, we have work, we have families, we don't want to take time off work, we don't want to, lie ourselves up in our bedroom and just like, cover ourselves up with the blankets for, days and weeks on end trying to deal with it. A lot of people don't think they can do that. They don't know how to access help. They don't know how to admit what happened. They're ashamed of it. And then they keep sweeping it under the carpet and sweeping it under the carpet. So what do you think would happen to somebody who just keeps trying to push forward and trying to ignore that voice that says this gets to be dealt with?
I can definitely relate because at the beginning, that was me. I thought, okay, I see that this is bubbling up, but it's probably just because I'm drinking. I should just stop drinking. If I stop drinking, it'll go away. You know what I mean? Um, I think that it's important that we listen to it, kind of what you were saying. If we don't listen to it, I think it becomes almost like a stronghold. It becomes a stronger and stronger reaction to the point that we start hurting the people that we love unknowingly. We don't realize like the damage that we're doing if every time our husband comes near us, we back away out of fear. Maybe once he could be like, oh, I'm sorry, I realize I triggered something. You know what I mean? But if that's happening over and over, he is going to think that it's something with him, not something with you. You know what I mean? And that became an issue with the guys that I was dating, is that I had to then explain to them. And I hadn't been telling this story. My family didn't know the story. Most of my friends didn't know the story. And yet these guys I barely knew. I had to tell them what happened because otherwise they were either thinking I'm psycho crazy or that somehow it was them. And that's almost for me, I think the realization, I'm just now coming to this realization as I'm saying it out loud, that's what made me realize, no, actually you need to acknowledge this, because as long as you don't acknowledge it but you're reacting to people that way, it's not fair to them. You're bleeding on people who never cut you. It's not fair to the people in your life. At the end of the day, like, we want to be healthy for ourselves, but we also want to be healthy for our families. And if
Yeah.
we're hurting them and they had nothing to do with it, we're not being fair.
I think what you said is so interesting about, I was bleeding on people who didn't cut me. And I think that is just such a powerful statement, because I think we do that so often. We have this trauma from the past that we haven't dealt with. It's buried deep inside us. And we're angry all the time. We're frustrated all the time. We just, like, at the drop of a hat, we will just lose our temper and we have no idea why. And we'll often look at the other person and think, well, that person caused it. But to just understand that there might be something deeper going on inside that we get to pay attention to and get help around. Because the other thing people will do sometimes, and I think you've kind of talked a little bit about this, is kind of put up walls to other people, right? And protect ourselves from other people because we're afraid of those people. They haven't done anything to us, they haven't hurt us, but we're using transference, right? And we're kind of projecting what happened to us in our past onto that person without even realizing it. So when you gained that awareness and finally realized what was happening and where you were acting out of in this place of hurt and pain and trauma, how did that empower you, just having that awareness?
I think it was really a game changer because you can't heal something that you don't know that it exists. You know, you can't move forward if you don't know that something's tying you backward. You know, it's like trying to run a marathon when you have this giant weight like tied around your waist that you're carrying with you, and how can you run forward when this giant weight is holding you backward, but you don't know that it's holding you backward, so you're trying to run and run and run and you're not moving. So I think that it allows you to be like, oh, there's a weight back there. Let me cut that off so I can actually move forward and step into whatever God has for me.
Yeah, so powerful. And yeah, and that image of the weight, that's a really interesting image because so many of us are carrying these invisible weights and they're weighing us down so much, but we don't even realize they're there. And just being able to become more aware and understand what's going on inside us and what's making us tick and what's making us, act out. If we're willing to actually go there and discover it, which I think is hard to actually go there and acknowledge what's happening and say, you know what, I want to get help with this. That's a very brave woman who says, I don't want to be like this anymore. I want to understand why I'm like this and allow God to come in and heal those areas inside me. But if we don't bring them into the light, right? If we don't surrender, how is he going to be able to really heal us when we're always just trying to do the next thing to cover it up, right? So
Mhm.
that's really powerful. And I know, we've talked about how telling your story as you're doing now, it really helps break those chains around us. So maybe you can unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah. I know for me personally, having kept my story a secret for so long, even my family, I only told them when I started speaking about it because I obviously wanted them to hear it from me and not while I was on stage. But this wasn't until 6 years after it had happened. And for me, the first time that I really felt like something broke off this freedom was the first time that I ever told my story in front of people. And I wasn't planning on telling my story in front of people. I had actually, I was going on a journey with God, really, of healing from this. And one of the first, he probably told me in January um, that he wanted me to speak and write about it. And at that point, I hadn't dealt with it at all. So I was like, God, there is no way that I'm going to speak and write about this. Nobody in my life even knows about it. And then here, fast forward 6 months into June, I'm in Peru on a mission trip, and we're working in the schools with children. And we're doing these skits about identity. And then we would break the kids out into small groups, 5 to 10 students, and we would just talk to them. And I remember on the first day of that trip, God said, tell those little girls your story. Because I just had girls. He said, tell the girls your story. And I'm like, God, what do you mean tell them my story? I don't talk about this. This isn't. And he said, I want you to tell them your story. And so I said, okay, God, I went out on a limb here and I told them what happened. And 3 or 4 of the girls in this group of 10 had been raped and then told me that they'd been raped and they'd never told anyone before. And some of them it was happening, regularly by somebody in their family. And I walked out of that small group being like, wow, God, um, that was really powerful that these little girls who'd never told anybody anything were willing to share. I was a complete stranger. They didn't know this foreign, older Caucasian person, and we're working in the mountains of Peru, like completely different scene, complete stranger. And they're telling me their deepest inner secrets. And the next school, I'm in a small group. He says, tell them your story. I said, okay, God, I'll tell them again. So I told them, and we had these small groups 5 times a day. And by the fourth day of the trip, every day at each school, somebody from our team would get up on the microphone in front of an entire school and give their testimony. Um, and on that fourth day, God said, you're going to be the one today. You're going to give your testimony on stage. And he told me which day, and he said second school. So it was very clear. It wasn't like I could ignore it. I knew exactly what he was saying to me. And we got to that school. That school was 1,000 students. I was in front of 1,000 high schoolers, and they weren't all high schools. Some were elementary schools, but this one particularly, it was middle and high school. And there were 1,000 students, and God said, "Go tell them." So I got up on stage with like still having maybe told a handful, less than 10 people my whole life. I got up on stage on a microphone and I told the entire story. And when I finished telling that story, God whispered in my ear, "It is finished." And later that week, one of the other guys on my team said, "Katie, it was weird when you were telling your story on the stage at that one school, when you were finished," he said, "I saw like a vision, right? Not actually physically saw." He said, "I saw that you were carrying this like big Santa Claus like bag on your back." He said, "When I met you, I saw it. And then I saw it again. I had that same vision when you were speaking. And when you were done speaking, it was like somebody came and they cut the bag off your back." And
Mm.
I just started bawling and crying because that was exactly how it felt. Like a giant weight had just been lifted off of my back. And I felt like God said, "You are free. Like this is a weight that you are leaving in Peru. You're not going home with this on your back." And so for me, it was, yes, telling my story was incredibly healing to the little girls because then they could have a safe place to share their stories, which I think is huge. But it helps both parties. It also helped me start my journey of healing. It got left in Peru. Since then, I have not cried when I spoke about it. That was the last time that I was speaking from a place of pain. Now I speak about it from a place of redemption. I can literally have a smile on my face and be like, "Oh yeah, I was raped." Not because it's a good thing, but because I'm completely healed.
Wow. That's amazing. And yeah, I mean, you get emotional when you hear you talk about it because just having that opportunity where God spoke to you and you listened to him, right? Not everyone listens to God when they hear his voice. So you chose to listen, which is amazing. And then you felt this weight, this bag that you'd been carrying around, all this baggage just drop off of you. And how God will ask us to step out in faith sometimes and share a story or be vulnerable or be open about what's going on, and we're scared. A lot of us don't want to step into that because we don't know what people are going to think of us, and what if it doesn't turn out, a certain way that we think it would turn out. And you were so brave in stepping into that situation and saying, "Okay, God, I'm just going to listen to you. I'm just going to say yes to you right now. In this moment, you're calling me to do something." And so what kept you in a place of saying yes and not saying no to him at that time?
It's interesting because the night we weren't allowed to talk about God on the microphone at the schools. We were in public schools. And back in January, God had told me to write my story. I wrote for a magazine at that time. And he told me to write my story for the magazine. And I was like, "Oh no, God, like, no, 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 thank you." And then I got hit by a car. I was in a really bad car accident a couple weeks before my trip. And I honestly, to this day, think that the devil was like trying to wipe me out with that car accident, because that car accident just, my whole life changed after that accident. And like, it's that verse, the devil's trying to use it for evil, but I will use it for good. Like, that was what that accident was for me. And so then I was on bed rest literally up until the Peru trip. Even on the Peru trip, I was on painkillers all day, every day, because I was in so much pain. But I was like, no, like, God wants me here. I'm going to be here despite all this pain. I'm going to take the painkillers and I'm going to power through. But right up until then, I was on bed rest because I had herniated discs in my back in the car accident. And so I had all this bedtime. And so God's like, "Remember that article I told you to write? You didn't write it. Now you have time when you have nothing to do because you're stuck in bed." And because I'd had a concussion, I couldn't even be on my computer.
Mm.
And so I wasn't supposed to be on screens at all. So I'm literally in bed with nothing to do. And so I had written my story out, not knowing that the purpose of writing it out was to process it for the purpose of this trip. And then the night before that he told me to speak at that school, he said, "I want you to write your story again without using my name, without saying God in the story at all." And I thought that was kind of weird. But it was when I was in Peru, he speaks to me very clearly in general. But I think sometimes when we're on mission trips or when we're in a space of serving, he speaks to us even more loudly and even more clearly because our hearts are even more surrendered than they normally are because we're not distracted by our own life. And so he was speaking very clearly to me when I was in Peru. And he had said, "Write the story out without using my name." and we would be up at 5 a.m. and we wouldn't get back to our hotel till 11 p.m. So he's telling me this at midnight, and I'm exhausted from the entire day's work. And so I fell asleep writing, and he woke me up and he said, "You didn't finish it. Get up and write it," in the middle of the night. So I was like, okay, God. So I got up and I finished writing it out. So then the next day, when he told me to speak, I had actually written it out the night before without saying the word God in it. So I had notes. And
Mm.
so I was prepared without knowing that I was preparing. And that made it like, okay, God, I see what you're doing here. I see what you did there. And I want what you have for me. So I'm going to step out in faith.
Yeah, and that's so important and so beautiful is when God calls us to do something, even taking a little step in faith, like when he says, take your hands off the wheel, or I'm asking you to do this thing. Are you going to say yes to me? And think if we, you just shared a really amazing testimony of what happens when we say yes to the little things, when we say yes to the things he's asking us to, not knowing where it's going to lead, but just trusting in faith that if we feel God telling us that, either we hear it audibly or in some way, right? Some of us really hear God, and other people just get this feeling deep inside, or other people see visions, right? We all experience them differently. So if we feel that, how often do we say yes? Because what you've talked about, and like the topic of our talk today, is having purpose come out of our pain. So how would you talk first of all about purpose coming out of your pain? Like, how has that pain you've been through led to your greater purpose on this earth of sharing more about God, but also your unique assignment? And maybe you can share a little bit about how women watching, like, that their pain is not for no reason, like it's going to be used for good. So maybe you can speak on both of those points.
Yeah. One of the things that a friend of mine prophesied over me when we were in Peru, and he said, "You're 1 foot in and you're 1 foot out," speaking about my relationship with God. He said, "You're 1 foot in, you're 1 foot out, and God is ready to reveal to you your purpose, but you have to go 2 feet in first." And I don't think he realized at the time the power of what he was saying to me, because I really took what he said to heart. And I got home and I said, okay, God, because at that point I wasn't involved in drugs or anything like that anymore, but I was still going out and getting drunk. I was still going to bars and partying, um, and just not walking, with the Holy Spirit and with the Lord the way that I am now. And I came home and I said, okay, God, I see that you have a bigger vision of what is happening here that I'm not aware of. And I want in, I want to be part of it. So I'm going to go 2 feet in. I'm going to give up the drinking. I'm going to give up the partying. I'm going to give up all of it. And one of the things that he had told me in Peru was stop wearing makeup, cut off your nails. He said, I want you to get rid of all these things that I was so, God, why are you doing this? Like, wearing makeup is not a sin. He told me stop. I didn't wear my eyelashes. I love fake eyelashes. I didn't wear my eyelashes for a year. I had to cut off my nails and stop wearing heavy makeup, because when I first went to Peru, I had glitter eyelashes, I had glitter long nails, all these things. And he said, I want them, when they talk to you, to see me. And when you're all dolled up like that, they see you. And he said, I want people to see me. So I need to strip you down so that when people are seeing and hearing what you're having to say, they're not remembering Katey Maddux, they're remembering Christ. And so I said, okay, God. It took me a while. This wasn't like an overnight thing. It took me a while to get rid of my nails and to stop wearing my eyelashes and my full face of makeup every day, all the time. And within about 2 or 3, I'd say within 2 months, it was August 13th, that God, my pastor always says, the two most important days of your life are the day you're born and the day you discover why you were born. And for me, August 13th was the day that I discovered why I was born. And he, in a dream to me, revealed what my purpose was, which was to speak to women on how to use their purpose, or how to use their pain to share God's purpose. And he said that that is your purpose for your life, is you're actually going to speak on stages and you are going to speak to women, specifically in the church, directing them towards me. And at the time, I thought it was just about rape. But now, having been a year and a half into this journey, I realize now there's actually so many more things that he wants me to teach. And I'm on the back end here, just being quiet in my room, just journaling and writing. And I know I'm supposed to write a book, and I know I'm supposed to speak on spiritual warfare and teaching women how to war in the spirit, and all of these things that at that time I didn't know, but I had been given a vision years ago, like 5 years prior, of me on a stage with like some obscene number, 20,000 people in an amphitheater, just speaking and helping people be set free.
Mm,
And he said, that is your purpose. That's why I gave you that vision so long ago. And I think that when we surrender our pain, he can do more with it than we could ever think or imagine. And I know that, he can do more than we can ask, think, or imagine, but we don't realize he can do more than we can ask, think, or imagine, not with the good, but also with the bad.
yeah, it's so true. And I love that, because I think so many people that are watching this right now are thinking about their own pain, what they've been through, and wondering, but how is God going to use that? And I know even in my own situations of pain and trauma, many years I wondered. I didn't even believe in God for many years, but once I became a Christian at age 30, I was like, how is God going to use this awful situation that got me to church and got me to being a Christian?
Mhm.
I didn't know how he was going to use it. It was too awful to imagine that he could use it for good. And he did. And I couldn't believe it. And that kind of started that journey of really trusting. And I was a pretty new Christian at the time. And then getting involved in another really awful traumatic situation and thinking the same. I thought, I know God, you've used other things for good. So I trust that you're going to, but I just don't know how. And out of that, this whole ministry that I do now was born. And I just know from personal experience how he will take the pain that lays you out, the pain that makes you question why you're here or whether you should even be here anymore. The pain that you just don't know how to deal with. You're so stuck and you don't know how to get out of it, and that he wants to use it for good. So I love what you said about surrendering our pain to him. And what does that look like? Like, if they're listening right now and they're going, yes, I'm ready to surrender my pain to him and have him reveal my greater purpose, how would they do that? How would they surrender their pain?
I think it's going to look slightly different for everyone, but for me, it was, as you've kind of spoken on, like what I teach on is the ACT method: acknowledge your pain, commit to healing, and tell your story. And I think surrendering kind of falls under the category of acknowledging your pain. It's not just, okay, realizing, yes, I have this pain, I have this trauma, but then saying, God, I'm going to lay it at your feet. I'm going to give it to you because I know that you can do more with this than I could ever do with it on my own. And then asking him, what is the first step in healing? And because pain is like an elephant or like this black hole of a vortex. It seems so big and so scary. We have no idea what to do with it. I remember when I first acknowledged, okay, God, I see that my rape is a trauma that needs to deal with. I have no idea what to do. I had just moved to Miami like 2 weeks before that. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know any therapist, like nothing. And I asked him, what is the first step? What do I do first? And for me, he very clearly answered, you need to forgive your rapist. And that was a huge step in healing for me. And it wasn't like he said it and then I forgave in my heart. It wasn't like that. He said, you need to forgive your rapist. And I had to say, God, give me the strength to do that. And then I said, okay, the next step, the next piece of that was, okay, God, I am committing to forgiving him. Help me to feel like I'm forgiving, because we can declare it and have it not be in our heart. But I think when we ask God for the strength to do things that he's commanding us to do, why wouldn't he give us that strength? So at the beginning it was, okay, I'm going to declare it with my mouth, I'm going to do it in my head. The feeling comes later, and that's fine. Or maybe you never feel like comfortable with it, but the fact that you're surrendering to it and saying, God, I want to do this, I think that's what he's looking for, that's what matters, and that our soul will kind of come around in due time. But asking God, what is the first step? Because my first step might be different from somebody else's first step. I read a book called Redeeming Love. And I had gone to California and shared my story with a childhood friend of mine. And when I got home, she had sent me this book, and it was about it was a fictional story, but it's based on the Bible, of the story of, I think it's Rahab, the prostitute who gets married, but she keeps going back to prostitution, and how her husband just has this unconditional love for her, and he keeps going and pulling her out and pulling her out and saying, "Come home to me, come home to me," and she keeps going back, and it's because she felt she didn't feel worthy, and for me the feeling was I felt damaged. I literally had guys that I tried to date who, once they learned I was raped, they wouldn't speak to me anymore, and in my head I was damaged goods. Like, what guy is going to want a girl? This is so traumatic. This is too much for men. They don't want a girl who's been through this, because now she has baggage, I have baggage, I'm damaged goods. And so part of my journey was learning to say, no, actually, you're redeemed. Actually, you're healed. Actually, you're this. And that book kind of opened my eyes to the incredible redeeming love that God has for us, that says, no, you're not damaged goods. I'm going
Mhm.
to use this pain.
Yeah, so beautiful. And I love what you said about just asking him. Each one of us can ask him, what's our first step? Or what's our next step? Where do you want me to go next? I'm really praying that he would reveal that. And then that whole idea around forgiveness. And even if our soul isn't quite ready to forgive, we can forgive with his spirit in us that gives us the strength. And then hopefully at some point, our soul, our mind, and our heart will catch up. And I believe it will. But really allowing God's spirit, which is so much stronger than our soul, to just overpower us with that grace and that forgiveness for someone else that hurt us. It really in the end sets us free, right? And what you said, I wanted to go back to this too. What you talked about when you talked about telling your story and breaking chains, what came up for me was that, and I think this is a really important point, that when you tell your story, you break your own chains that are around you, you let go of your own baggage, but you also help others to break their chains, because you allowed these girls to share their own story in a place where they felt safe. You were vulnerable, and you created that space for them to be vulnerable and open about what was going on with them. And I think for those women that are watching that are afraid to share, you never know whose chains you're helping to break. You're breaking your own chains, but you're also breaking other people's chains by being open and vulnerable. So I just think that's so beautiful. And this has been such a pleasure. And you have shared so much amazing wisdom. And if you were going to leave these women with one last just step that they could take, or one last piece of wisdom, what would that be?
I think asking God questions. Don't be afraid to ask God questions, because there are so many things. He wants our dependence on Him. And if He gave us all the pieces at once, we wouldn't need Him. We would just go off and be the strong, independent women that we are. And He's like, I want you to be strong and independent, but I also want you to be dependent on me. So I'm going to give you different pieces at a time, so that you have to keep coming back to me for the next piece. And I think that He does that intentionally, because He wants relationship with us. And so I think that going back to God and asking Him questions, we're allowed to ask God, why did this happen? He might tell you why, He might not, but you're allowed to ask the question. And the other thing is, I think we're allowed to be vulnerable in all emotions with God. If we're mad at God, like, He can take it. He can take that you're mad at Him. I mean, you can read the Bible. There's tons of people who were mad at God. King David even lashed out at God. He can take your anger, just pour it out on Him. One, it will help you release it. But two, it won't offend Him. He's unoffendable. You know what I mean? Just pour it out and then say, God, thanks for listening. You know, what do you want from me? What do you want me to do with this? Where do you want me to take this? So I think that people almost feel like they need to be, with God, I need to be gracious and kind and whatever. And He's like, no, like, show me your raw emotions. It doesn't scare me. It's fine. Just tell me what you feel, and then we can talk.
Yes, that's such great wisdom. And I want to thank you so much for just sharing your story and allowing other women to experience their own freedom by you sharing, by you being vulnerable and open, and them being able to reflect on what's going on in their mind and heart and say, maybe if she can do it, I can do it too. So thank you so much for that encouragement and wisdom. And just being so open and honest with us today, Katey. It's been such a pleasure. And those of you tuning in, be sure to catch the next masterclass on being deeply rooted in God's love. I'll see you there. Thanks,
Bye.
Katey. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone. Thank you for watching. If you connected with this content and it helped you in some way, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, check the description below for special gifts just for you. See you in the next video.